When I say the name Slender Man, what's the first thing that comes to mind? The original Something Awful photos? Some of the other iconic photos? Maybe the Marble Hornets series? Or maybe it's the game. Originally released in 2012, Slender the 8 Pages was made by Parsec Productions, a game dev company run solely by Mark Hadley. The game solidified the Slender Man character in popular culture. Looking at the game now, it isn't very impressive. So what made it scary at the time of release, and is it still scary? Welcome back to the Creepy Files. Today we're talking about the Slender game from 2012 that took the YouTube world by storm. To fully answer the two questions, why was it scary and is it still scary, we have to look at the context of its release. I believe Slender the 8 Pages is the most influential indie horror game ever made. At the time of release, indie horror was a genre in its infancy. There were a few games that came out from small indie companies like Amnesia, Penumbra, Cry of Fear, and Lone Survivor. But if you look at the indie horror market today, it's clearly much larger than it was. And Slender, in my view, is what brought the genre into the mainstream. It created a shockwave of games influenced by or completely copying the original. And that is still evident today. But to fully understand why it had such an impact, let's look at the mechanics. Many games before Slender had collectathon elements. Banjo-Kazooie, Crash Bandicoot, Sonic, Donkey Kong, and many horror games had these portions too. But Slender stripped away all other aspects. This made it extremely easy to replicate. In a nutshell, the programming behind it is pretty simple. Every time you collect something, add to a value. The value gets to 8 and you win. Add an enemy who basically just stands there unless you're looking away, and you've got a pretty simple formula to copy. But just because it was easy to copy doesn't explain why it was so effective. So why was it effective? Well, at the time, most horror games looked like this. And while some of these games were indeed scary, Slender captured a new feeling. Again, the mechanics of the game were stripped down. That doesn't just mean that they were simple to replicate. It means no guns, no grotesque monsters, no big theatrical setups or giant beasts, just you, a flashlight, and an enemy you're not even supposed to look at. The fear of the unknown was captured perfectly in this way. Almost complete darkness with a dying flashlight, you have to look for tiny pages through this darkness. So as you're straining your eyes in the dark forest, you are priming yourself for being scared, especially with an enemy who you only get to look at for a second. Is that a tree or Slender Man? Slender Man's appearance is also extremely important. As a 3D model, he's not actually that scary in the game. But his figure blends into the trees, and his silhouette, once recognized, is pretty iconic and unsettling. A dark figure with no face, but he always seems to be staring at you. Obviously, a lot of credit goes to Eric Knudsen for creating the Slender Man character, but his integration into the game is the reason it was so effective. Let's talk about the sound design. When you first start the game, there's no scary music, no spooky ambiance. But this is what makes it terrifying. All you hear is the sound of the night air and your feet on the dirt. Even though the graphics weren't anything fantastic, this use of sound design makes everything seem so real. In real life, you wouldn't hear spooky violins or a deep drone. It'd just be the sound of the trees and your feet. And it really helps improve this feeling of actually being dropped into a forest at night. You're not being told how to feel. The tension is built simply by the situation. But as soon as you collect a page, the ambience does build. And it sends you into even more anxiety. If before didn't warrant music, what does now? It also helps players learn as they play. The more pages you collect, the more aggressive Slender is, and the building ambience tells us this without having to actually tell us. In fact, the only instruction you get in this whole game is at the very beginning. Collect all 8 pages. So, we've talked about the sound, mechanics, visual design, and context that made the game scary at the time. But is it still scary now? Well, after playing through it recently, I can safely say yes. It definitely doesn't get to me like it did when I first played it. But the things this game does aren't something that can be tired out so quickly. Even after knowing the formula and playing game after game that was inspired by or just straight copies it, the simplicity of this game is what keeps it unsettling. I'm not sure there will ever be a time that peering through the dark for another landmark won't be unsettling, or the relief of finding a page only to be followed by more tension will ever be ineffective. And the fear of turning around after picking up the paper in the claustrophobic bathroom area will never go away. What did you think of this episode of the Creepy Files? It was a bit different from what I usually do, but I want to try and diversify a little bit. There's only so many times I can cover a spooky VHS series before I want to try new things. Let me know what you want me to cover next on my Twitter or Instagram, and I'll see you all next time.
Is he alive even? Yeah. Oh, he's pissed. He looked at